start? I've never had a chair panel who is an ex-environment minister before.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Moving toward policy.
Yeah, yeah.
It's cool. It's cooler to be ex-environment minister than me.
Really? Why was the environment minister? Why was that bad? Was it too much? Was it too hard?
I was twice. First, I was as an expert, and then was 5 years ago.
Yeah, right.
Secondly, I was chairman of a Green
Oh
Party.
my God. Anyway.
Are there any commitments with respect to phase out of coal?
No. And they just lost the election on it because, and I'd say partly because the Greens were not going to start showing corners. The funded Greens. Other Greens are trying to do.
Interesting was the corrupting minister from agriculture.
There's a lot of corrupt. Who's next?
So we still have some time.
So that we can what?
We get more time.
Oh, yeah.
Before I start officially, because it's still 1:29, I should tell you I'm completely amazed. I participate in many meetings and conferences and workshops and seminars, and I'm turning 60 within a couple of days, and I've never experienced that the audience and the speakers and everybody is silent before the start of the meeting after the lunch. So it's a great cultural gap in between Central Europe and India. Congratulations. And this is how I turned into 1:30. So it's my great pleasure to moderate this this afternoon session. The topic of the session is nomads, nature. A big one. Is nomads, nature parks. Yeah, we will get to it. And environmental policy. So in Tibet, we have 3 speakers here. We start with Dr. Tashi Nema from Peace Research Institute, Oslo, Norway. And the title of the lecture is already on the screen. And then we have Professor Ruth Gamble speaking about the role of the national parks. And finally, Dr. Lobsang Yangtso about Chinese environmental policies and its implementation in Tibet. Some of the issues we've already opened in the panel session 1, but I'm eager to listen the presenters. And it is like that you have 20, each of you 20 minutes for your presentation. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Welcome back to the hall, and I hope you enjoyed the lunch. As you can see, the topic of my presentation is resettlement to what ends, revisiting China's ecological migration policy and its original goals. My primary focus is ecological migration, but I would like to kind of put a larger picture and context to the policy itself. So I'm going to focus, this ecological migration in Sanjiangyou area of Qinghai province. Next, please. So what I will do is I want to put through this the most important question here. What is at stake when it comes to pastoralism in contemporary Tibet? To bring you to the heart of the matter. And then I will go on to Tibetan pastoral life and urbanization since 1980s to put a kind of a bit of history of pastoralism, not so much of history of pastoralism per se, but policies related to pastoralism since 1980s. And then I will go on to, to look at China's ecological policy drive and the making of Sanjiangyou, and further to the ecological resettlement and other forms of settlement. And then to pastoralism in Sanjiangyou National Park, which is the kind of new changes to the policy that happened in recent years. And finally, I will, land on some concluding remarks of, what has really happened and how it impacts, pastoralism and pastoralists in Tibet. Next, please. So what is at stake? I think it's quite safe to say that Tibetan pastoralism is under pressure. Pressure from above, pressure from middle, pressure from below. As you can see, pressure from above, we have already touched to previous speakers, it's the policy, Chinese state policies that impacts pastoralism in Tibet. But then you have also this neoliberal market force, which is somewhat neglected, but it really also impacts Tibetan community, society in general, inside out. It's something that's also neglected to a certain extent when we focus too much on policies. There's the larger picture of neoliberal market force. And then the climate change. These three forces are, the primary forces from above. And then you have pressure from middle. Pressure from middle, when I say pressure from middle, it's the social attitude toward pastoralism. It has not always been good, positive, attitude. There is some kind of, attitude that pastoralism is a primitive way of life. I think this kind of view is also prevalent to some extent among the local elites, people working within the government, even Tibetans, not just Chinese. When you have that kind of view, it kind of contributes to the negative policies that impact pastoralism, the diminishing pastoral way of life. And then you have pressure from below. There's the pressure of cash, the urgency or the need of cash, or, people are talking about money rather than other values, other, things, pastoral way of life. So there's this pressure that also impacts pastoralists. And there's the labor, which I think previous speaker has touched to some extent. There's lack of labor in pastoral community when young generations, not all young generations, but many of young generations, don't get that interested, enthusiastic about, continue this pastoral way of life. And then there's family pressure. one family moved to a town, and then that drags the next family from the pastoral area to urban towns. So the overarching questions for Tibetan pastoralists today seems to be how can they adapt and survive under these pressures, and more importantly, to thrive without losing their own way of life. That is what I call resilience. And I think this is a very important concept. Resilience has to be concretized. It's not a buzzword. It cannot be a concept that is flying in the air. It has to do with the way people live and the way they can continue their they can come to a kind of compromise between tradition and modernity, and to go on and live as nomads. I think that's for the nomads, it's a very important question. So moving on to the history part, since 1980s, traditionally there has been a kind of complementary and dependency between nomads and farmers in Tibet. And with the collectivization, that dependency is being disrupted. When I say dependency, it's like, exchange, economic exchange between the nomads and farmers. They sell their goods to, each other, and they move to each other. There's a kind of self-organized dependency, which is very important for, the sustainability of Tibetan community as a whole in Tibet, as a cultural group, as a people. And that's, with the decollectivization, that's dependency to some extent recovered. Although I don't go to that extent as Melvin Goldstein and Cynthia Bell, who described, who did the fieldwork in 1986 and 88, and says that there's a full recovery of this traditional dependency, or not dependency, but full recovery of the traditional pastoral way of life. When I interviewed elders, Tibetan elders, I get a kind of picture that, it's not that fully recovered. There's a, to some extent a recovery of this dependency, but it's not as, this dependency not as deep as it was previously. But, having said that, in 1980s is the best time for Tibetan pastoralists before the 80s and after the 80s, during the decades of Chinese rule in Tibet. So the third work form in 1994 highlighted urbanization as the sole development path, which contributed to a kind of shift from this self-organized dependency to dependency on state structures of urban centers. And now farm and pastoral produce were to sustain the urban centers through government-instituted markets. Next. So traditionally, towns has been like kind of the center of learning, religious life, and trade. And to come to the modern cities, it has been transformed as a melting pot of ethnic integration and assimilation. So the role of cities have also been changed. And there is this growth of urbanization, which we can see increased for instance, in TAR, from 23% in 2030 to 31% in 2018. And in Yushu, for instance, rose from 32 to 36 in 2010 and 2017, respectively. So these data are just to give you a kind of, picture of the, this longitudinal picture of, how urbanization rose from earlier and now, not to let you compare these two region, Tar and Yushu, because it looks like, Yushu has more urbanization rate than TR, as you can see here. But there is a problem with the measurement of urbanization rates because criteria are different. Urbanization, there are two different criteria as far as I know. One is the population, the household registered population, and the permanent residence population. So the criteria are different. So the outcome, of course, will be different, right? So this is just to give you, a side information. And cities has been the magnet of migrant workers, of mining, logging, damming, construction work. So the cities has become a center of not just the government institutions, but also public enterprises and government companies that are centered in the cities. So that draw in this kind of activities, logging, mining, construction work, and also governance, political structure. And because of this rate of urbanization, it has led to a kind of degradation of the plateau, and which led again to the floods and natural disasters in the central plain of China. And that again urged a kind of environmental awareness on the top, and that led to the official environmentalism in the late 1990s. So what that has contributed to is a series of policies, which I want to give you just kind of an overview. The first policy is the Tianbao Gongcheng. It's a natural forest protection plan in 1998. So there has been this logging going on for decades until 1998, and when it was kind of there was a stop to the logging largely. So that has contributed to some of the areas where like for instance Jietang, which is very much depend on logging income. Like it's around 70 to 80% of the income for the local government depends on logging. And when the policy shifted overnight, that created a kind of implication, a huge implication for the local government, and they had to transform their local income to tourism and other source of income. And then there's a Tui Geng Huangli, Grain for Grain program, which started in 1998, which is basically a kind of a replantation of forest trees. For farmers, it encouraged farmers to plant trees in exchange of grain subsidy. And then there's Sanjiangyuan Provincial Nature Reserve, which started in 2000. It was started in 2000 as a provincial nature reserve, which later became a national nature reserve, and now it has become a national park. And then there's Tuimu Huancao, retreat pastures to restore grassland, which is, I will come back to that later, which started in 2003. And then national nature reserves and national parks since 2016. There are many of these national nature reserves became national parks. So the making of Sanjiangyuan has been a very important kind of. Now it has become a household term in when it comes to ecological migration and ecological preservation or conservation in Tibetan areas. So what is actually Sanjiangyuan? Sanjiangyuan is a concept created in 1990s, in late 90s, when a group of scientists from Chinese research institutions, both in provincial level and central level, took an expedition to these areas, which normally Sanjiangyuan is not a Tibetan word. It's headwater regions of these three rivers. It's a Chinese term. So they came back with a report which stated, open up the Great Northwest, protect Sanjiangyuan, 开发大西北，保护三江源. This was the kind of title of this presentation, the report. So this provincial government began to, pay attention to this report, and it was also encouraged by central government to form this nature reserve in late 1990s. And there was also allocation of fund from the central government, about 7.5 billion RMB. So it was a huge amount at that time for the provincial government, because there's we have to take other factors, not just ecological preservation, which is it appears like it's the ecological conservation which is the major interest. When it comes to creation of this nature reserve, there's a huge interest from the provincial government, because there's this fund, this big fund. They thought, one of the government officials I talked to in provincial level is that they thought this 7.5 billion was such a huge fund. So they began to, kind of pay attention to this and, trying to create something, to really get this fund. But later they regretted because that money wasn't too much. So because taking, into account of the mining reserves and everything, that lies in these areas. So the representations of Sanjiangyuan then become a very important project. It's become a kind of metaphor for water security as well as biodiversity. And there's this poor area, representation of Sanjiangyuan as a very poor area that has, 56% of the poorest countries in Qinghai and 63% below poverty line. Poverty line, I have to put this in because poverty is also, you have to question what is poverty, because poverty may not be, the kind of poverty we are here talking about. It's more of a, poverty that is calculated from this, the average income, while, there's a big subsistence capacity that pastoralists normally have, which is not taken into account. So it has to be taken, this statistic, as previous speakers also alluded to, it has to be taken with a huge grain of salt. Then ecologically, there's a decline in precipitation, the representation of this decline in precipitation, water volume, and shrinking glaciers. Some of them are true, while others, are, have to take in with, as I said, be skeptical too. So yeah, then there's ecological migration policy with Shentan Yimi in Sanjiangyuan. The government has invested a huge, amount of money since 2005 to achieve this win-win goal, Shuanyi, of alleviating poverty while restoring grassland. The program aimed to reduce 1/4 of pastoralist population, 1/3 of the livestock population, 1/6 of rangeland, which is core area, banned from grazing. And the ecological resettlement differs from other forms of resettlement, because there are several kind of settlement which we have to be careful. The one is the Fuping migration, which is anti-poverty migration, and then there's a settlement, Dingju, which has been going on for decades, which means settling the nomads to fixed place, but it's not a total abandoning of the pastoral way of life. Then there's housing, this comfortable housing program, which has been going on in TAR, not outside, the comfortable housing policy, which has been, a project that helps to build houses, particularly for rural and suburbs of the towns. And over 100,000 pastoralists were permanently resettled as ecological migrants in Sanjiangyuan. And this is the site where I did field work. It's Qinghai province, and the yellow one is the Yushu prefecture, and the pink one is Yushu county. And my field site lies in that pink area. Next. And this is one case that I studied, one of my PhD dissertation, Yushu settlement case. And here, 222 households and 867 pastoralists were resettled since 2003. And 2004, sorry, with a budget of 11.88 million RMB, and 91 households with grassland use certificate, while 130 households do not have grassland certificate. Grassland certificate affects what kind of compensation they get. Those with certificate get 6,000 per year, while 3,000 for those who do not have grassland use certificate. And then there's 449 females and 418 male poor or average families. They are, mostly poor and average families. According to the statistics of income, a majority age group are 25 and 45. 80% is unemployed. When I say unemployed, it mainly includes those who do not have a fast or fixed, permanent job. But while some of them are doing petty jobs, like temporary jobs, not permanent jobs. And main income is caterpillar fungus, which they go like 2 months, 3 months in summer to pick, and which is a highly valuable product in pastoral area. And then there's the subsidy, from the state. Yes, next. Yeah, one thing again, they've been resettled resettled from this site after the earthquake because the Yushu city has been expanded, and this area lie what they call red line, Hongxian, of this expansion, urbanization expansion. So they were again resettled from like 3 to 4 kilometers away from the city. Next, please. And the picture, by the way, is the next generation of this resettled communities. And then Sanjaya National Park and its rationale. I have to touch a little bit because this is a new change to the whole policy. I think it looks like, how much time left?
Let's say 3 minutes or so.
Okay. It was officially launched in 2016, and what the rationale is the new era, 5-in-1 policy that combines park management with economic, political, cultural, social, and ecological development. Don't ask me what this means. This is the rationale. They're trying to combine different aspects, to manage, this resettlement. So I put out, the rationale, of the government. Yeah. And what implication it has is that there's a direct management of resources and land, which is very important because when you have a nature reserve or a park that is governed by the provincial level, so central government has not much to do with the management. But when you create a national park, a national nature reserve, the management, shifts to the central government, which is in direct control. So there's also a huge interest among the top leadership. For instance, President Xi Jinping went to these places 3 times and also addressed to the local population of the importance of nature conservation. And so it looks like there's a national park provides a kind of positive signal. There's no need for national park, there's no need to resettle. It doesn't require, the nomads to be resettled. But having said that, it's too early to say anything really concrete how it will impact the pastoral community. As far as, the policy itself is concerned, if you compare it to the previous policy of ecological migration, it is a shift to a positive direction. Then there's a pastoralist, as I said, pastoralist participation in protecting efforts. One ranger, one of the part of the plan for this national park is to give one, have one ranger per household who gets like 1,800 RMB per month as a salary. For per household. So yeah, this is the national park. You have it's actually a map that shows the distribution of rare wildlife animals. But I just, because it provides a better picture of the national park, so I used it here. Yeah, so you see the red, those areas that is in the red line, they are the national park. You have the third, Zate, and Ngolo Mate, 3 areas. But then there's also another county, Chumale, which is also part of this. But it's not shown in this map. Next. So, resilience and sustainability, state of Tibetan pastoralism. So what this whole looks like, pastoralism. I have to emphasize that this dependency, this again, I want to come back to this resilience and dependency. There has been a shift of this self-organized dependency to the dependency of state structure and market forces. So there's, this diminishing dependency of this self-organized dependency, which shifted to the state structure and subsidies. So. This is for pastoralists to have a resilient community. It's an obstacle to some extent. Sanjaya National Park appears to be a good news for local pastoralists, as it does not require them to be resettled in the first place, although it is as yet too early to say anything conclusive at this stage. New national park may create space for resilience. Because since you have a kind of income source there, if it's being used in such a way that they can create, this community into a more resilient. But it's also an open question because there are several actors needs to be in place, because pastoralists, they can't create everything by their own. They need support, civil society, and business, community, and even the state government policies to create a kind of conducive environment for resilient pastoralism in Tibet. So it's in a way contributed to the sustaining of this life expectancy of Tibet pastoralism in the long run. The situation of previously resettled, this is important, the situation of this about 100,000 resettled pastoralists, their problems are still remain forgotten even after 50 years of resettlement. These communities remain like kind of in the limbo. Many of them are unemployed, and they don't speak, most of them don't speak Chinese well, and they are not trained, as skilled workers in urban centers. So they need, there's need to be effective follow-up for these pastoralists. And last, ecological protection become viable and effective when local pastoralists are, seen as stewards, not as problem. And this is to recognize the importance of cultural tradition as well as indigenous ecological knowledge in conservation effort. And this is the most important in this conclusion. Thank you. Sorry, I think it.
You're absolutely all right. Thank you very much. It's a very interesting lecture on environment and social relations. And thank you. So let's continue. We will have again, during the first panel session, we will have questions and answers by the end of the block. So I would like to introduce Professor Ruth Campbell. She will speak about national parks on the Tibetan Plateau. Take your time. You have 20 minutes.
Thanks. Okay. So that's the title of my talk, as you can see. And I should also point out that this picture that's in the background of it is from the upper reaches of the Yalung Tsampo River, and it's a frozen wetland. And you may notice a theme of wetlands going through this the slides of my presentation, because I'm a bit obsessed. All right, next slide. Okay, so the actual talk. I wanted to start today because I was thinking my talk actually zooms way out. From Tajanima's talk. He's talking about how national park is working in one place, and I'm talking more generally about how national parks developed in China and the traditions that they come from, and the way, the philosophies behind it, so we can understand how to engage with it. And up on the screen I have 3 photos, all related to places that were set aside for natural reasons. And I've got 3 very short anecdotes to fit with all of those. And so the first one down on the bottom left is me, and when I was 6, and I'm in a national park in Australia. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I was a very happy little colonialist at that point. And when I grew up, I wanted to be a national park ranger, and I had no idea that I was standing on stolen land. And I had a very intense personal attachment to the idea of a national park and to what had happened to me in national parks, and how that had connected me to the environment. And I think if the Tibetans are talking about national parks in the international arena, everyone keeps talking in the international environment into those groups, you have to recognize that there is this intense, and it's pretty much a white person attachment to national parks and what they've done for us at other people's expense. The one on the top is another wetland, this time Zoiga. And I put that up there because a few years ago I was standing right near that spot, and next to me was a man who will remain nameless, who everyone kept telling me was the most powerful person I would ever meet, who was a Chinese environmentalist. And he was looking out over this area, and it's a wetland with lots of birds, and there'd been a decrease in bird movement into the area. And he said, the problem with this place is the people. If we just got rid of the people, it would be fine, right? This place would be fine. And then I said, well, what would you do with the place if there was no people here? And he said, we could come and watch birds, right? And this represents this idea of a fortress conservation, which is predominant, but comes from us. Not China. This isn't a Chinese tradition. This is a Western tradition. And the third image that I have here is an image of Tsari, which was in the southern borderlands of Tibet, and is often presented as being a place where the Tibetans locked up a place in order to have a environmental protection. It was sealed off and you weren't allowed to do certain things within it. And there's this idea of cultural protection and natural protection in this area. And what I want to suggest in this case is that this program was also problematic. In the process of sealing off Tsari, the Tibetans stole land from local groups. They enslaved people, and they also polluted the area and created destruction. So there's all of these traditions that have some good. I loved being in national parks. The birds are coming back in Zoiga, and Tsari got to operate as a sacred site for many years, but they also have problems with them as well. Next slide. Okay, so if we take a step back, we have this idea of national parks, and everyone's talking about national parks in China and presenting it as if it's a Chinese idea. It really isn't. Yeah, there was a documentary on PBS a few years ago that said national parks, America's best idea, right? And there is this saying through national park history about the problematizing this tradition of it being such a good idea. And part of this stems from the fact that there is a really clear link between national parks and colonization. The idea of a national park arose in colonized settler states. Primarily, America had the first national park, Australia had the second, then Canada. It was these settler colonies where we came in, took people's land. In order to create Yosemite National Park, next slide, the indigenous peoples were all driven off the land so that white people from the suburbs could come in and from urban centres could come in and stare at nice natural environments. It was the same in Australia, the bottom left-hand corner. The national parks were created by land clearing of indigenous peoples. And we actually still have the same thing happening today in India with national parks being created through Adivasi people being pushed out of forests. Right? This is an ongoing process. Conservation, where you have the need for conservation needs to be balanced with the needs of local indigenous people who got their sustenance from the area. And so there's also today even continues to be conflicts in national parks with poaching in Africa and India and Southeast Asia, where people are dying, people are getting shot and for their practices in national parks. So it's still a place of contention. That's what I wanted to argue. And the other thing that's really interesting for me about this is that, so all of these national parks were developed in colonial spaces, including India. The British were really good at sealing off places and saying only they could go in and shoot things and nobody else could. And a lot of India's national parks actually started life as game parks for the British, right? And then they were taken over by the nation state after it was set up. So it's interesting to me that so for example, Europe, which wasn't as much of a colonial space, was doing the colonizing but not in its own backyard, they didn't start developing national parks until after the World War II, where it became a place for people to relax on the weekends. Yeah. So I think that what you had happen here was when you have colonization, when you have people moving into spaces, they don't have other traditions of connection with that place that take you out of your own space and into another environment. So I'd argue that the places that had a tradition of pilgrimage and moving through places in a sacred way tended not to have national parks until much later. So this was China has a big heritage of pilgrimage, Tibet, of course, and India, of course. You all think of those places, but also Europe. Europe has a really long history of pilgrimage, and there was people who would go to Canterbury. I studied the Canterbury Tales when I was in high school. Lourdes in Paris. There's a big tradition of having a sacred interaction with your environment that's developed over generations in all of these places, but not in places that are occupied, not in settler colonies. So then you get this other perspective on an environment that is the place from which I think national parks developed. Right, and the other thing is that I wanted to make clear is that pilgrimage, it usually gets presented uncritically, and I wanted to just get us to think about that for a moment. I have a friend who works in Bulgaria whose job it is to make bricks out of discarded plastic. Yeah, and she said that when it's pilgrimage season, the amount of rubbish in that place doubles by 700%. Right? Pilgrimage has not necessarily been good for the environment all the way back through history. So it's just thinking about what that means. You need large states to facilitate pilgrimage. You need coordination between countries and or passage, and it hasn't always been great. But I would say that, and I think that we may need to make a distinction when we're talking about the Tibetans' relationship to the environment, that it wasn't all good. Right? There was things that were good and there was things that were pretty bad, like tree being cut down and so on back in history. And if we're going to use history as a method to try and understand Tibetans' environment, we need to be really critical about it, because you can make mistakes if you just pick the good bits and ignore all the bad bits. Right? It's a complex history. People are living people are complex. People are complex from minute to minute, let alone century to century. So if we're going to engage with environmental history, we need to do so critically. That was the main thing. So I'd say that the kind of traditional pilgrimage routes and the concentrations of wealth and the chopping down of forest and so on in Tibetan history weren't fantastic for the environment. But there were other traditions on the plateau that were really good. And if I can have the next slide. Oh, my wu wei's gone. Oh, I had another thing in there, sorry. It's not your fault, it's mine. There were different traditions in Tibet. So there's been, I don't know if you've been aware, but there's been a big argument within academic circles about whether Tibetans can claim to have been pre-modern environmentalists or not, right? And basically that's because you can find evidence for the protection of environment and you can find evidence for the destruction of the environment. And so we had things like collapses of civilizations in Western Tibet that were in some ways brought on by the activities on the plateau of chopping down trees, of not living in sustainable ways in a very marginal environment. So there's some evidence for not being environmental and there's others for being environmental. And what I want to start arguing, and people can push back against this because I haven't figured it through completely, is that when you have local groups engaging with the environment, they do so in sustainable ways because they don't want to die. It's pretty simple. So there's this idea of I don't know if it's whether they were environmentalists or not, but they were definitely survivalists. And if you want to live in an area, to survive in an area, for your kids to survive in an area, you need to look after it, right? So what you do get across the entire plateau is all of these localized traditions of protection for things like migrating birds. This is a place in between Shigatse and Lhasa, which was always a spot that the black-necked cranes flew into and has been preserved for hundreds of years at least. For these birds to find their space. So you did have localized traditions, but I would argue it was localized traditions as opposed to necessarily a state dedicated to the environment's protection. Right? Okay, so we have all these different ways of relating to land. That's another place where they looked after the land, and it's all Tibetans, but that actually brings me to the next point that I wanted to say. And what you get in these localized responses to the environment is something that my friend, the geographer Robin Bartel, who's an Indigenous woman in Australia, kept talking about as the bespoke environmentalism. Right? So if you have a nation state, they tend to make a law that focuses on everybody. Yeah? Nobody in this land shall do blah, blah, blah. But if you have local traditions, they will say this side of the hill is where we graze in the morning, this side of the hill is where we graze in the afternoon. Right? When you have law, L-O-R-E, as opposed to law, L-A-W, you tend to have flexibility and bespoke responses to environmental conditions as opposed to something coming from above that is a blanket rule for everybody in that polity. So you tend to get more responsiveness. Right. So that's kind of the three different strains. And then it's like, okay, what happened when and where did the Chinese nation decide that they were going to get involved in this national park malarkey? Yeah. So it was really, really late. Right. So it was kind of a catch up. Every other major nation in the world has national parks. We need them too. Post the opening up in the 1970s, and the first batch in 1982 was a really limited series of national parks. And it wasn't until 1988 that you got any of them up on the Tibetan plateau. And I should say, I couldn't find any, this is me trying to find national parks. I couldn't find any report saying exactly when each one in Tibet was done because they've broken up Tibet into all the different areas. So if there's some I've missed out, please forgive me. So it was slowly you're getting these national parks developed, and there wasn't that many, right? There's not that many national parks on the Tibetan Plateau, and there's a reason for this. A national park is actually there's two parts to it, which I guess sounds obvious, but we often say things and they lose their meaning because we say them all the time and we don't question them. Like, so I was thinking about this because when I was a kid, when I thought national park, I thought holiday, right? But if you look at it, it's a nation's park, right? And I know that sounds obvious, but a nation means who's running this place, who's in charge. It's the central government is in charge of the national park. And why is it called a park? Yeah, that's not a park. This word, zhongyuan, is like what you say for children's parks, yeah? It's not like it's an area that someone's controlling, right? You don't call a wilderness a zhongyuan. Is that right? Yeah. So, yes, because I remember my daughter's learning Chinese and she always says, I'm going to the park. Oh, chu zhongyuan. Okay, so there's it's this idea of the nation making something into an accessible, controlled space. And it's actually quite hard to do that on the Tibetan Plateau. It's hard to put all of the things to function in order for that to happen. So what you have happening, can I have the next slide instead, is a whole different array of conservation forms on the Tibetan Plateau. And I think this is something that's really important to keep in mind, because when people start talking about China's work in conservation parks on the plateau, they tend to be blanket and not think about all the different distinctions. So you have national parks, Guojia Gongyuan. You also have national nature reserves. And you have national wetland parks. And then you have Ramsar wetlands, UNESCO sites, national geoparks, national forest parks. And there's actually, I found out, national mining parks. Can we go back? Who came up with that? National mining parks and eco parks. But there's no, as far as I know, there's no national mining parks on the plateau. Right, so you're getting all of these different different forms of conservation, and they all have different levels of control. So a nature reserve has more parts within it, and it's less directed from the national government, has less resources than a national park itself. Right, and the UNESCO sites have external funding. So do the Ramsar wetlands. So it's important. So part of the control of these sites in Tibet is down to what I was saying before. It's the international community that's controlling these places. It's not all the Chinese government. And the Chinese government's response to this was to the international community. It wasn't part of their own thinking necessarily. Okay, so yeah, national parks. And then, I was up to that one. And then, next slide. Okay, this is the scientific group we went in with to have a look at the wetlands in Ruogai. And the other thing is, within the national parks, you also have different zones, as you were saying before, which was really interesting with the mental blank. Sangjiang Yuan. And you have sub-areas within them. So Sangjiang Yuan has wetland conservation areas, wildlife conservation areas, shrubland and forest conservation. It's not just the same processes and the same ideas for the management of any of these programs. And the other thing is that there's different areas. So I've seen some reporting saying they're going to seal off this whole area and not let anyone in, but most of these places have mixed-use core and buffer zones, right? So I think it's important to remember when you're saying that their area has been dedicated to a national park or a national reserve, that doesn't mean no one can go anywhere. I mean, in Sangjiang Yuan, they were able to stay. Some of them are able to stay. It does mean that you've shifted control of that space to the nation, right? This is basically what's going on. It's gone from being local control to centralized control. Right, and that space has been dedicated primarily to conservation, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's no access for anyone ever. And it's complicated. There's also, though, has been, and I think it's fair enough to say, there has been a strategy on part of the central government to use the central Chinese government and to use ecological control as a means to manage areas. Again, I would say that their idea manage areas socially and politically as well as ecologically. And again, I would say that they got this idea from us. That's what the West did. That's actually what India does in terms of controlling spaces. But they, as with many things, they've taken it and run with it. So you get a lot more control. So you've had a multiplication of national parks since the third plenary session when it was announced that they would do it. It's been linked to forced removals. And then in this means that you can use the idea of a national park to get people to move from isolated communities where they were quite self-sustaining into the economic mainstream. And I would say that this is a big part of the movement of people through. It's not just that they're being put into places where they can be controlled, but they're also given bank accounts and are linked into China's. It's a way to generate GDP growth, if nothing else. So, and again, there's this idea. It's also linked into the idea of the ecological civilization and ecological system services. Ecological civilization is a Chinese idea, and it harks back to it's supposed to hark back to Confucian ideas of like management and privileging of civilization over the wild in traditional Confucian paradigms, right? So traditionally, when you were Confucianists would say that anything that is untamed is dangerous and less worthy. Yeah. So Wen, the civilization is Wen is there was Wu and Wen is a sense of something that is worth cherishing. So the idea of linking ecology to civilization is some way of trying to bring it into to promote ecology within the Chinese conversations. And the idea of ecological system services is something that's the management paradigm that, again, they've taken from the West. As other people have said, water security is part of this. And the other thing that I wanted to say with this is when you're thinking about the Chinese context, it's a really good idea to remember that there's a lot of they could be working for tabloid press, some of the scientists there. They come out with these outrageous statements that people go, oh my God, they're going to build, I've seen this in the Indian press a lot, they're going to blow up a nuclear weapon and build a dam on the Yalong Sanpo. It's like, no, they're not. Some idiot just got a chance to speak. You know, there's and the same with this. They said that someone was going to do a survey to help draw boundaries of a 2.5 million square kilometre park, which is the entire plateau pretty much. That doesn't mean they're going to do it. Right? This happens all the time, and even all the way back through history. It's propaganda, which they're very good at. Right. Yeah. Oh, I've nearly. Oh, have I run out of time already? I'll finish. Yeah. So what I'm getting at after all of this, there's a philosophy behind these parks, and it has two elements to it. There is the idea of, some of it's actually quite good. There is the idea of national environment education, a way to enhance the enjoyment of nature, to get people to connect with nature and therefore to be able to conserve it. But the thing that comes along with it in the Chinese context, as per usual, is this idea of national pride, right? That national parks are a statement of how good China is. So this is clearly going to be problematic because it means that they're going to present it in a way that's not necessarily ecological, but pride. And there's also the problem of who owns them, because it means that it's this very direct ownership by the nation state of the parks, as opposed to any individuals from the area being involved with it. I'm running out of time, sorry. But amongst all of this, what I wanted to end with was this idea that it's pretty bad. Like, clearly you guys know that there's a lot of government control on the Tibetan Plateau, and that, you know, they've taken a leaf from our book and decided to colonize the place and take its resources and everything. It's not a good look. I'm not saying it's good. But if you're actually going to do something, and because I kept thinking, going back to that idea of the Tibetans, whether they're ecologists or not, what they were survivalists, right? So this is basically about survival. And I was thinking about it from the Australian context. Every Australia Day since I was about 12, I've been on a march against Australia Day that's called Survival Day. The Indigenous people call it Survival Day, right? They have this idea we were colonized, but we survived. Yeah, and so I was thinking that in the Tibetan context, what we're looking at is survival and how you do that. And so that within the national park paradigm, I actually think that there's quite a scope for the Tibetan people to engage, to survive, to flourish. So having national parks also means that if people were involved in it, the national parks I worked in Amdo were run by Tibetans. There was education programs for Tibetan people from the area who hadn't finished high school to learn how to be guides, and they were also letting people in when they weren't supposed to. So there was a lot of Tibetan involvement in it. And I was going to go back to the beginning with me being happy this is to end, being happy in the national park. When I was a kid also, I used to go to I was a junior ranger. And the people that took us for junior rangers were actually Indigenous people from the region. And they told me all of the stories about where I grew up. So I actually grew up in similar ways to Tibetans, with the idea that I was living between hills that were gods, that had been fighting, and that I lived in a space where they had achieved some kind of agreement. And we were introduced to this idea of the world from very little age by the Indigenous rangers in our area. And so there is a sense, if Tibetans can grasp that opportunity, to move into that space, to use it as an educational tool. And I know it's not the best, it's really making the best of a bad bunch, but to move into that space and create it as an educational opportunity to what the Dalai Lama says, Chinese brothers and sisters. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for a very enthusiastic presentation, and I think it's going to raise a lot of questions, starting with terminology and colonialistic behavior and the origin of nature parks. But also, I think that very interesting would be a discussion about misusing the term of national parks for the Chinese for the People's Republic of China interests, and registering these nature parks under UNESCO so that to get rid of a native people and nomads and and so-called protect the area. So thank you very much for this. And as you mentioned, by the end, you almost fulfilled your dream. You became a young ranger. So thank you, thanks. And so let's continue so that we have some time for the discussion. So the third presenter is Dr. Lobsang Gyatso, and you have a title on the screen. The floor is yours. 20 minutes, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So there will be some repetition of topics that Tashi and Ruth talked about. So today I'll be speaking on China's environmental policies and its implementation in Tibet. So over here I'll focus on the evolution or the instrument mechanism of environment protection in China, and then what are the mechanisms and the environment laws, and then also the limitations in Chinese environment protection. And then next I'll be focusing on environment policies in Tibet and how it has been implemented, and what are the limitations or challenges while practicing environment policies. Next. So the first one. So over here, what we see is that China has the largest population of 22% of world, and it has been also ranked as the second highest world economy. But China has enormous environment problems, and that has to deal, and that gives a huge problem to China in terms of in terms of economic growth and livelihood of people. But then when we look at the environment issues in China, the focus on environment also developed very late in 1970s, and so there has been the growth of institutional mechanism, and there has been also an upgradation of environment mechanisms. So the first environment, when we look from the state perspective, the first in terms of environment protection, the National Environment Protection Agency took the state the supreme power in terms of legislation, and then NEPA has been upgraded to State Environment Protection Agency, and then then it has been established as a Ministry of Environment Protection, and then in 2018 it has been called the Ministry of Environment and Ecology. So there is an upgrade in terms of environment institutions. And however, the Ministry of Environment and Ecology, they have a power to formulate the laws and regulations, but there is decentralization in terms of implementation of the environment policies, where we say devolution of environment responsibilities, where at the local level, it's the local environment protection bureaus who implement these policies. So over here, what we see is that there is not much of legal power in terms of the state when it comes to the environment protection or implementation of the environment. And then when we look at the laws, there has been laws and regulations in environment protection, whereas the environment impact assessment is one of the very important law, and which evaluates or the economic development, and then it also predicts the environment implication of the projects, and then it gives assessment and analysis of the environment impact of the development. However, there has been diverse view in terms of the effectiveness of the EIA, and because sometimes EIA gets a funding from a company, which funding from the company, and then in a way they are the ones who has to regulate or to assess the environment impact of that. So these kind of limitations exist over there. And then when we look at the 5 stages of environment protection in China, so in 1983, they have used the term sustainable development in terms of implementation of environment laws. And then all national and local government, they used a sustainable concept to guide their work. And then in the late 90s, China has faced a huge problem in terms of floods in China, and then the 1998 Yangtze flood. So that has also made to introduce measures like afforestation and formation of natural forests. And then since then, they have shifted their policy from boosting timbers supply to ecological protection. And so sloping land conversion program, which is like cropland into forest, and then natural forest protection program are the 2 major ecological programs introduced in late 90s. And then the third method is the change from end control to source control, where they focused on decentralized treatment, and then they try to limit the industries which creates lots of pollution, and then higher resource consumption industries were also shut down. And then in the fourth, then in late 90s also, there has been a point source treatment to catchments, a regional treatment, where policies like polluter pay policies to treat the pollution in key areas. And then there has been a shift from using of coal into more of sustainable energy. And then finally, there has been focus given more on in terms of legal and then economic sanctions when the industries, they pollute the environment. Next, please. So, and when we look at all these policies, the policies have different, outcomes, and there has been a mixed reaction from all these policies. And then government also, invest huge amount of money. Like right now, I think almost like 1.4% of their GDP has been spent on in terms of environment protection. However, there has been a limitation in terms of government policy instruments. And then because as I mentioned earlier, it's the top-down policy, whereas the state formulates the rules and regulations, but it's up to the local environment protection agencies to implement. So that has the top-down approach in terms of environment management is a really huge limitation or challenge. And then there has been also the issue of budget and budget allocation, whereas the state the central government doesn't provide the fundings to implement the environment protection. So it's up to the local government whether they want to implement the policies. And then there has been also issue of local leaders, whether they get a more incentive, whether their preference is more of economic development than the environmental protection. And then, right now, and the fourth one is also the space for the environment NGOs, and how much the environment NGOs get spaces, and because there are also legal the challenges that environment NGOs face. And then, but there are like some NGOs who try to find a space, and they also work in Tibet or in China to protect the environment. But then when we look over here, what we see is that earlier in the first session, we had speakers who spoke in terms of natural disaster, desertification, and also in terms of glacier melt. And so here, the difference that I see is that what we, Tashi and Ruth, we focus on the environment problems or environment issues where the state, they gives emphasis on that. So there is a huge differences, and what we focused are the policies that state formulate. And the previous session talked about the ground reality, the environment problems that people faced. So in Tibet as well, environment, there has been like lots of environment offices or implementations, and lots of departments have set up. And the early phase, when we look at in Tibet, has been focused more in terms of studying the natural resources or studying the area, and then slowly there has been focused in terms of establishing environment protection improvement plans. And next please. And so over there what we see is that the state also has their own environment laws, and then the TAR government, Tibet Autonomous Region government, they also issue their local regulations, and there has been lots of regulations that we see in paper. And then also the TAR government, they release measures to implement state laws and regulations like grassland law and water law. So they release measures to implement this. So but these are the policies. What we see is that in paper the policies are really good. So it's like how that policy is implemented is what we have to study and what we have to analyze. And then, so when we look in Tibet, as earlier Tashi Nyima also focused about Western Development Campaign or the Open Up the West. So Open Up the West, which came in early 2000s, where much of the focus has been given to the Western region in terms of environment protection and in terms of infrastructure development. So that has also led to introduce many of the environment projects that we see in Tibet. And then there has been also a huge amount of money that has been used in terms of environment protection in Tibet. And so over there, what we see here, I'll be focusing on 3 major environment policies that has been introduced by the government. And these are the policies that formulated by the state, and it's get implemented in Tibet, because these are the policies that we see in the paper and from the state, and which gets also funding from the state. So that's why we see these policies hugely implemented in Tibetan areas. And so like there has been lots of repetitive, and I will not go much on that, but in early 2000s, the major emphasis has been put in terms of natural forest protection program, and then there has been afforestation, banning of lodging, and then it has been mainly focused in many of the upper reaches of the rivers. And then there has been in that afforestation program by the Chinese, there has been also a participation of local Tibetan in the environment policies. And then there has been sloping land conversion program, where the land, the cultivated land, the crop land has been converted into a forest. And so this is considered as the one of the largest land retirement program in the world. And that the second is the construction of nature reserves. So right now in TAR, they are like almost 47 nature reserves, and which counts like 34.35% of the total area of TAR. So when we talk about the nature reserves, I think there are limitation in terms of economic development, and then Sanjanyuan nature reserves is one example which has been like implemented in Tibet. And next, please. And then the third program is pasture into grassland program. So pasture into grassland program, there are also like few policies that has been implemented, and the first one is household responsibility system, where the private the grassland has been privatized, and there has been a land ownership. So in this policy, there is this policy adopted like a tragedy of commons. So that's why they introduced the privatization of the grassland. And then another policy is the retire livestock and restore grassland. And then the major the objective of this is to restore grassland. But then when we look at the especially the grassland program, so there are like two common issues. That one is that these policies are introduced to restore the environment, and then the economic development or the poverty alleviation. So these are the two major themes that the rationales behind these policies. But then implementation of these policies are different from place to place, because at the end it's the local government who implement. Next, please. And then when we look at the grassland policy, comfortable housing program is very much implemented from since 2006, and the objective is to improve the living condition of the local farmers. According to the government, the objective is to improve the local farmers and the herdsmen, their livelihood. And then in 2009, the destocking policies were to adjust the herd size, and then when a nomad they reduce their animals, they get subsidies from the state. So, and then compensation for eco system service has been also introduced in the Tibetan area. So when we look at these policies, these are the major policies introduced from the state, from the above to the Tibetans, to the local people. So as I mentioned earlier, the rationale behind this is first is to elevate the elevation of poverty, and the second is environment preservation or conservation. But then when we look from each program, so especially in terms of afforestation, there has been very limited provision of subsidies to the farmers, even after the short-term subsidies ran out, and then compensation has not been adequate to many farmers to develop or farm income. And then when we also look at the nature reserves, so when the nature reserves are or the national parks are introduced, there has been a displacement of people from the area, and then which also leads to economic marginalization. And then the third is when we look at the grassland program also, there has been economic marginalization. And so when we look when we analyze the whole thing, because the rationale behind all these policies, the poverty elevation, but in ground reality, there has been many studies say that the livelihood has not changed that much, and people economically they don't have much of subsidies, and then they get to depend on the state subsidies, which has both economic and then sustainability and livelihood sustainability. And then it also has a political implication, because once you get involved in political activities, there are chances that you might not get subsidies, or your family members will not get a subsidies. There are cases like that. So there are lots of negative impact of all this dependent on the state subsidies. And then once the people are removed from that land to have a nature reserve or to have a national park, people lose their control over the land, and then they really have no control whether that area is been used for mining, or the people don't have a direct control over that. So these are the also, problems that we see. And then the state control over the people. I mean, when you are in nomad, you are free to move from one place to another. You don't need an ID card to go from one place to another. But once you are removed and put in a very concrete house and giving an ID card, you are under state surveillance. So there are so many issues, and then you can't travel from one place to another. So there are many cases, like suppose the people from Nyarong, when they come to Kanze, every time suppose the government comes and asks you to show your ID card, and if you are from Nyarong, so whenever you show ID card, some sound comes over there. But if you are from Nyarong, the sound is louder. And when people from Kanze goes to Lhasa, and when they show the ID card, and then the people from Kanze gets a different sound than the Lhasa people. So that's also restricts people, and it has lots of implication on environment and people. So it's like we really need to study more on that. Next, please. So when we look on all in all these policies, the first is the top-down approach. When I see in terms of environment issues, it's more of a colonial approach, colonial mindset, that we are the one who are, it's our role to set the policies and you have to implement. And because of that, when the policies are written, it is written in a Chinese language. But the question is, do the Tibetan people, the nomads or the farmers, do they really understand the policy that has been written? Do they really understand the rationale behind all this? Because when the policy is written, it has been written in a Chinese. And then there are Tibetan who work in the Chinese governments. They are the ones who translate the policies into Tibetan language, right? So when they translate, they use lots of jargon, lots of political language in the Tibetan translated paper, which is supposed to read by the nomads. And so when you have a very difficult, and since most of the nomads or the farmers, they are not literate, or they can't read well, so they don't understand. So over here, the loophole, the problem is that sometimes the local leaders, they explain or they misinterpret or they interpret the policy in such way that the local Tibetans listen what they say, but the rationale, the reason behind is that they don't understand. Because when we look at in terms of nomad relocation, they're like Tibetans, some understand that since they are relocated, they were giving subsidies. And there were like cases, Tibetans saying that I have not taken the subsidies for 2 years because I thought that this subsidy must be for me, for the price for the land. But this subsidy has been given for them to, sell out their livestock. So there is we see lots of misinterpretation, and it's the dominant who formulates the policies, and then there is so much of chances of misinterpretation of policies. And the language has been also a really major issue when in terms of introducing the policy at the local level. And so that's why there are like cultural politics of policy translation. And then the third is the local level policy implementation is not very unitary and cohesive. But then when I look at the policies, what I realize is that next please. So the much of the states, emphasis has been given in terms of, beautification of project, that we see in Tibet, building, railways or the nature reserves or national parks. But what I really find or missing in the policies, not much attention has been given in terms of the waste management at the local level. And because at the local level, at the village level, the waste is I say that it's one of the major issue that we see. But then there is like, especially in the case of Kanze area, there is no waste management at the local level. And so the Tibetans, they throw the waste in the river or in the landfill, and the waste that you see over here are the waste created by the hospital. So I mean, so I think, but these kind of issues, or the issues that raised in the first panel in terms of grassland degradation, desertification, or the natural disasters are not much given emphasis in the policies, whereas the policy is more about the beautification, or the state, creating the Tibet as a tourist area, and which can create lots of economic benefits, or the tourists who can come and then see the land as a museum, and not really care about how much that will affect the livelihood of the Tibetan people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It sounds quite sad to me, and I mean, I met quite a lot of times His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and we always spent at least half of the debate on the environment. And I remember first time we met, he raised the issue of a railroad, of the rail, and considered that as a real disaster for Tibetans, an influx of Chinese in one direction, and exploration and raw materials transportation the other one. And just for me a confirmation that it's a fake by the time you try to combine a non-transparent totalitarian communist regime with a nature protection. But I don't want to be too critical. It was a perfect description of what all can be written on a paper. But I wanted to raise the issue a sort of provocative form, so that we also listen to the real experiences from the ground and how this policy is being implemented in a real life. So that, though we saw some pictures which showed us. So now the time is for your questions. Please go ahead, raise your hand, and let's start this part of the session.
My first question is to both Tashi Nyima and Ruth, because whose topics kind of relate to each other. And the case is the Sanjayu National Nature Reserve, before now becoming a nature park. What happened was in 2000, during the President Jiang Zemin period, the Sanjayu Nature Reserve was declared. And at that time, thousands of Tibetan nomads were removed from those areas to create that nature reserve. And in 2013, on 16th August 2013, the Qinghai province gave license to a mining company to mine inside that very nature reserve where Tibetan nomads were removed. So here is a clear contradiction between what was done in the year 2000 and then what was being done in 2013. And so the Tibetan nomads were being pushed around to create a nature reserve. And then that's a question to Tashi Nyima. And my question to Ruth is that there has been other such cases where even the boundary of nature reserve being moved either to the north or south without changing the actual area. So do you see more such contradictions about the nature park that being created in Tibet to, as Lobsang said, to beautify Tibet in a such way? So that's my question. And then to Lobsang Yonsu, the second question to Lobsang Yonsu is the environment policies in Tibet. And in 2016, on 4th May 2016, there was a case of Menyal Hagan water pollution case, where a lithium mine company released mine waste into the river and caused mass death of fish. So here the environment policies and regulations were not implemented. And there were many other such cases. So if all of you could highlight a bit on those issues, please.
Shall we collect another question, please? I'm sorry. Shall we collect another question? Okay, go ahead.
This is again S.S. Bhakdi from Institute of UN and UNESCO Studies. Well, first question is, between the Chinese expansionism and extraterritorialism and environmental protection, conservation consciousness, and all that, on which China lays the more emphasis, especially at this time. Secondly, China is the biggest producer today in the world of greenhouse gas emissions, around 25-26%, as compared to United States 14%, European Union 10%, India is around 4%, and an industrialized country like Japan, which is the third largest economy, is only 3% GHG emissions. So China is still the biggest polluter in the whole world with 25-26% greenhouse gas emissions. So how China is looking after this environment? You don't think it is just a phony gesture on the part of this great nation which believes more in nibbling and grabbing and gobbling the territories of other countries?
Thank you very much. Let's start with the answers, and later on it will be your turn. So the first questions were from Dempa up into each of you. So if you can start as the questions were raised here.
Thank you, Dembala, for that question. Yes, there is. You could see a contradiction between the ecological protection, the policy that being implemented since 2003, which I presented the case, which is also a result of that ecological preservation effort in 2003, actually during President Hu's time. These people, this resettlement actually they were resettled from one area. It's about 70 kilometers away from Yushu County. Once they've been resettled, so there was some also mining activities that were there. But who were the mining companies actually mining there? I think there are like different companies involved, like big enterprises, provincial level, national level, and even local level mining companies that do carry out these mining activities. I don't think the government has kind of that full control over the mining activities. The government also, you can deconstruct this government, authorities into different levels, like central government and then the provincial level. Let me just give you one example. In 2010, there was this mining after the resettlement of some migrants from other areas to Yushu town, nearby Yushu town, and there was this petition, the petition to the central government to stop this mining activity by the local nomads, and they went all the way before the earthquake happened. They went all the way from Yushu to central government to deliver this petition, and they pointed out some mining companies in that petition. They were helped by some people also in Beijing to deliver this petition, and the State Council got that petition. To some extent, again, influenced the behavior of these companies. Then the central government, State Council, notified in a way to the local, this provincial level authority, and they had a meeting during that. After that, they had a meeting in Yushu, I think, where this mining companies. There are quite a number of mining companies, and there's restricted areas. They pointed out, some companies were like kind of, just to, forbidden to carry out this mining, to continue this mining activities. So it's not like, when there's this ecological migration effort is being carried out, there's no mining. There is mining, actually. There's mining activity. It's a kind of matter of a degree. It is being there. It's still now. In Sanja area, there are places where mining is still going on. And like in Golo, it has been there like for decades, like 50s and 60s. That's why Golo, compared to Yushu, it's the number of Chinese population is larger. So they actually has this historical background in mining. That's why they were there in the first place. So from that time until now, there has been, mining activity, but it is somewhat restricted to, to a kind of minimized level. Yeah.
Thank you. Let's continue with answering these questions.
Okay. You just push it once. All right. I was just going to say about that, by the way. The Australian government has just pushed off Indigenous people from their lands in order to create a coal mine for an Indian billionaire, right? So this isn't just something that happens in China. The difference is that in both Australia and hopefully India, people will protest against it and can stand up for it and have a discussion. So that I think sometimes when people talk about China, it's like everything bad happens in China and no one else is doing anything bad. The second part of the question, that's just the most disturbing thing about the Tibetan Plateau for me at the moment, apart from, intense surveillance and locking people up and stuff, is Losana said that they were treating it like a museum. I really wish they were treating it like a museum because they'd learn something, right? It's a selfie spot. It's like the whole plateau is somewhere you can go. Yeah, and even the way that, because I was saying that the national parks, the way they're set up, there's also this massive list of things that are called scenic spots, which people line up to take selfies. And some of them are like they're like sacred sites. Truxon So is just depressing because it's got a yacht terminal that takes you out to the monastery that was like a sacred site. And then I've got pictures of lines of people doing selfies there, right? So, and they're going to put dams in Lhasa so that there's a better reflection for better selfies. The whole thing is just changing the space that's there from a place where people live and engage with to something to be looked at. Yeah, and that's like, I'd say, the idea of the national park, some of it is to create that idea of the image. But then, like I showed the picture of Ansel Adams, it wasn't that much. This exactly happens in other places too. And so I'll just leave this comment here. I think that maybe if we're in China, they would be saying that India had extraterritorial ambitions. And so maybe, there's some issues there, and there's some people along the border that see things in different ways. But in terms of emission trading, they actually launched the world's biggest, because this is, again, I think we need to be really clear, right? There's things that are bad that are happening and there's things that are good, right? China has launched the world's biggest emissions trading scheme. And it is like a goal changer. And I know people that are working on its implementation, and they're trying to work things out that are really difficult, but it's massive. And anything that they do, they're such a large economy, anything that they do is going to change things, is going to change the world's emissions dramatically. And considering how much, good on Europe for doing things, but how much America and, Australia doesn't really matter, but, how useless we are at controlling carbon emissions, I don't think that we should be too harsh on them for that one.
To Timbala's question, and when we look in Tibet, I think mining is also really a huge problem. And when we look at the environment protests in Tibet, the mining protests are the largest number, and we see lots of mining protests in Tibet. So when I see the mining protest or in Tibet, I feel that there has been maybe I think if the Tibetans, they could use the Chinese legal mechanisms, or maybe use the Chinese and the laws, and then maybe that could be also one way to stop mining in Tibet, and use the legal mechanisms and find a way through that. The second, I feel that since in my presentation I said that local government has a huge power in terms of implementing the rules and regulations in terms of environment. So and local leaders are are the ones who implement, and thus the people, especially at the some region, they have their legitimacy, and that also I think the people, the local Tibetans should try to influence the local leaders to give more preference in terms of environment protection rather than on the economic development. And the third, maybe I think over here, maybe I think we have the rising number of Tibetan environmentalists coming, and they also work in environment issues, and maybe they can also try to collaborate with the environment NGOs in China and try to have I mean, everything has to be very I think very sensitive over there, but then though I mean mining is also considered as a very sensitive issue, but I think maybe the Tibetan environmentalists can find common ground with the Chinese environmentalists or Chinese environment NGOs or the lawyers on environment, and try to find platform to raise the environment issues in Tibet as well. And with yours, yes, I mean in China, I mean there are like huge environment problems over there. But then I think it's China has economic relation with lots of countries, and so I mean not only China. I think that many of the Western or the developed countries, they also give more preference in terms of economic development than the environment. And if the rest of countries, if there is any possibility of putting a sanction, or then because I think when we look at environment and political and economic, I feel that in the international market or the international relation, much of the emphasis or importance has been given on trade than in terms of environment. So I think let's not just I feel that I mean everyone should take the responsibility. And then in China as well, as I mentioned earlier, there are like many actors who can also get involved, such as the media, the environment NGOs, and they are also one. They should also take more active roles. And then, as I said, in China, the rapid urbanization is one of the major problem, and so that's why I think China has to slow down its economic development so that it can have a safer environment for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, we're almost to close the session. I don't want to be unfair to the gentleman who wanted to ask the last question. So it's your turn, and then I will close the session. Thank you.
My question is to Dr. Tashi. I feel not settlement of the nomads, but providing facilities when they are moving from one place to another place for better livelihood, better grasslands. That is the answer. For example, I'll give in Arunachal Pradesh, when graziers move from lower heights to higher places, the school teachers accompany them, medical paramedicals accompany them, and they remain with them throughout their moving up or moving down. That is the best way, not disturbing their life, but continuous providing education and medical facilities. So with is Tibet, Chinese in Tibet, are they also doing something similar? Thank you.
I think ecological migration policy is the opposite of that what you have described. It's more of a moving the traditional pastoralists to the town by giving up their way of life entirely. So it's not so much of be there. That could be a solution actually, to start school in pastoral area and to provide medical service in their own area. So I think here, it's a way, I mean, ecological migration policy has been seen as a failure, although it's not being said clearly. That's why national park has come into this picture. 2016 national parks started just kind of, to recognize that the role of pastoralists in conservation But although that has its own limitation, that policy, but comparing to the previous policy of ecological migration, this one is a positive change to that policy. And if I can just say a short, give a short comment to the carbon release, that question, the previous question. Because it affects, in a way, Tibetan areas, it will, I think, affect Tibetan areas significantly. It has already done, actually. Carbon release, it's the main source of carbon release is the coal consumption in China. Coal consumption has been huge, but the government trying to kind of shift, central government trying to shift the consumption of coal to renewable energy. And one of the main renewable energy source of renewable energy is hydropower. And when
and production, but also a year-by-year increase. So it is also important to distinguish, because if you look on a solar and wind, it's clearly the cheapest technology of producing clean electricity in the world, and so it's good to differentiate hydro and this large hydro dams projects in Tibet and the potential of other renewables. Thanks all the panelists, and thanks to you for your active participation in a debate. And let's have a tea break, and let's click for all the panelists. Thank you very much. So then the engineer